Inside the mind of a killer, where biology meets choice. There's a moment investigators talk about, not publicly, not on record, but in quiet rooms after the tape stops rolling. It's the moment when a suspect stops pretending. The eyes change, the body relaxes, and what you're left with isn't rage, it's absence. That absence, of empathy, of fear, of connection, is where the real story begins. Because not all killers are built the same.
Evil versus the reality of wiring. We like to simplify killers. Monster, psychopath, evil, but neuroscience tells a more uncomfortable truth. Many killers don't feel the world the way the rest of us do. Brain imaging studies, particularly using fMRI scans, have consistently shown differences in key areas: prefrontal cortex, decision-making, impulse control; amygdala, fear, emotional processing; anterior cingulate cortex, empathy, moral reasoning.
In some violent offenders, these areas are either underactive, structurally smaller, or poorly connected. What does that mean in real life? It means consequences don't land the same. Fear doesn't register the same. And most importantly, other people don't feel real in the same emotional sense.
The psychopathic brain, calm in chaos. One of the most studied profiles is the psychopathic killer. Their brain doesn't spike under stress the way yours does. In fact, many show lower baseline arousal, meaning they are understimulated by normal life. That's why you hear phrases like, "He was so calm," "no emotion during questioning," "almost bored."
To them, violence isn't always rage-driven, it can be stimulating. Their amygdala, which should light up at distress or fear, yours or someone else's, often shows reduced activity. So when someone is begging, crying, or fighting for their life, it doesn't trigger the same internal alarm. It's not always hatred, sometimes it's nothing at all.
The impulsive killer. A brain under siege. Then there's a completely different category, the impulsive or reactive killer. This brain looks almost like the opposite. Overactive amygdala, heightened emotional response; underactive prefrontal cortex, poor impulse control. This combination is volatile. These individuals feel too much: anger, rejection, humiliation, and lack the internal brakes to stop escalation. This is where you see crimes of passion, sudden outbursts, violence triggered by perceived disrespect. In these cases, the killer often doesn't plan. The act is explosive, and sometimes followed by immediate regret. But the damage is already done.
Especially serial offenders, operate on an entirely different level. Their brain isn't just different structurally, it's shaped over time by fantasy reinforcement. Repeated violent ideation can actually strengthen neural pathways. The brain begins to reward the thought itself, long before any act occurs. This creates ritual behavior, planning and staging, emotional detachment during the act. To them, the crime isn't chaos, it's execution.
And here's where it gets chilling. Many of these individuals can function normally in society. Jobs, relationships, conversations, because their cognitive empathy, understanding emotions, may still exist, even if emotional empathy, feeling them, does not. They can read you, they just don't care. Nature versus nurture. It's not one or the other. The question always comes up, are killers born or made? The answer is both. Some individuals are born with neurological vulnerabilities, reduced emotional processing, poor impulse regulation, lower fear response, but environment acts as the accelerant: abuse, neglect, exposure to violence, social isolation. A damaged brain in a stable environment may never become violent. But combine biological risk with trauma, rejection, or obsession, and the trajectory can change. The most dangerous factor: normalization. Perhaps the most overlooked piece isn't brain structure, it's justification. Killers, across profiles, often develop internal narratives. They deserved it. I had no choice. This is who I am. Over time, these thoughts reduce internal resistance. The act becomes easier, not just physically, but psychologically. And once that line is crossed the first time, the brain adapts. Violence becomes less shocking, more accessible, more normal. There's a mistake people make when they picture a killer. They imagine someone visibly broken, unhinged, erratic, easy to spot. But investigators will tell you the truth is far more unsettling. Most killers don't look like killers until they do. And even then, only for a moment. In forensic psychology, there's a concept often discussed quietly but observed constantly: the mask. Some individuals, especially those with psychopathic traits, develop an ability to simulate normal human behavior. Not feel it, but perform it. They mirror emotions. They study reactions. They learn what concern looks like. This isn't instinct, it's rehearsal. And over time, the performance becomes convincing enough to pass friends, coworkers, even intimate partners. That's why, after arrests, you hear the same phrase over and over: I never would have guessed. Because what people are seeing isn't the person. It's the version of them designed to blend in. But no mask is perfect. Investigators look for something called behavioral leakage, small, often overlooked signals that something underneath isn't right. These can include inappropriate emotional reactions, smiling at serious moments, flat affect during high-stress situations, fascination with violence or control, subtle boundary testing in conversations. Sometimes it's even more subtle: a pause that's just a little too long, an answer that sounds practiced instead of felt, a reaction that's delayed, like it had to be calculated first. These moments don't scream killer. But together, they start to form a pattern. The fantasy loop. Where it really begins. Long before the act, there's the thought. And then the replay. And then the escalation. For some offenders, especially those who commit premeditated violence, the brain begins building what investigators refer to as a fantasy loop. It works like this: initial thought, fleeting, intrusive, sometimes dismissed. Revisiting the thought, curiosity replaces rejection. Detailing the scenario, the mind begins to script. Emotional reward, control, power, relief. Repetition, the loop strengthens. Neurologically, repetition reinforces pathways. The more the fantasy is revisited, the more real and accessible it becomes. Eventually, the line between imagining and doing starts to thin. Trigger versus permission. Not every killer snaps. In fact, many don't. Instead, what you often see is a combination of trigger and permission. The trigger might be rejection, humiliation, or loss of control. The permission is internal, a belief that the act is justified. This is critical, because without permission, even extreme emotion doesn't always lead to violence. But once someone crosses that internal line, once they believe the act is acceptable, the barrier is gone. And it rarely comes back. After the act, the brain adapts. One of the most chilling realities in violent crime is what happens after. For many offenders, the first act is the hardest, not emotionally, but neurologically. It's unfamiliar, uncertain, high risk, but the brain is adaptive. Afterward, stress responses can decrease. Emotional resistance weakens, confidence increases. In some cases, offenders describe a sense of relief, power, even clarity, which reinforces the behavior. This is why escalation is so common. What once required buildup becomes easier, faster, more controlled. Why some killers stop, and others don't. Not all killers repeat. Some commit a single act and never do it again. Others escalate rapidly. The difference often comes down to a combination of psychological reinforcement, external consequences, internal narrative. If the act solves a problem in the offender's mind, removes anger, restores control, fulfills fantasy, it becomes a viable solution again. But if it creates overwhelming fear, guilt, or disruption, it may never be repeated. This is where brain structure meets personal meaning. Two individuals can commit the same act and walk away with completely different internal outcomes. The investigator's edge: reading the mind without seeing it. Detectives don't get brain scans at crime scenes. They get behavior. So they reverse engineer the mind through crime scene organization, victim selection, method of control, post-crime behavior. An organized scene suggests planning, control, and often fantasy reinforcement. A chaotic scene suggests emotional overload, impulsivity, or loss of control. But here's the key: most offenders aren't purely one or the other. They exist in the gray area, which is where cases get complicated, and where misinterpretation can happen. The uncomfortable truth: we want killers to be different, obvious, separate from the rest of us. But the deeper you go into the psychology and neuroscience, the more that line starts to blur. Because the traits involved, impulsivity, anger, detachment, ego, fear, aren't foreign. They exist in everyone. What differs is degree, regulation, and the point at which someone decides, or allows themselves, to act. Closing thought: the mind is the crime scene. Every case leaves behind two scenes: the physical one, and the psychological one. The physical scene tells you what happened. But the psychological scene, the patterns, the behavior, the decisions, that tells you why. And if you can understand the why, even partially, you're no longer just looking at a killer. You're looking at a process. One that starts long before the crime. And, in some cases, doesn't end even after it's over.
When people hear mask, they think of something physical, a covering, something worn during the act. But the most dangerous masks aren't worn at the crime scene. They're worn in everyday life. And few names illustrate that better than Brian Kohberger, Ted Bundy, and Israel Keyes. 3 different men, 3 different eras, one shared ability: to exist in plain sight, while living something entirely separate underneath.
Kohberger's mask wasn't charm. It was intellect and detachment. A criminology student, someone studying crime, behavior, patterns. On the surface, that's curiosity, academic interest, but investigators and behavioral analysts often look deeper at cases like this. When someone studies crime obsessively, the question becomes: are they trying to understand it, or get closer to it? The psychological mask: quiet, reserved, socially distant, observational rather than expressive, blends into academic environments. Unlike Bundy, Kohberger doesn't fit the charismatic predator mold. Instead, his profile leans toward controlled internal world, possible fantasy reinforcement, emotional detachment rather than emotional manipulation.
The underlying pattern: this type of offender often builds internally. Thought right-pointing arrow analysis, right-pointing arrow obsession, right-pointing arrow action. It's less about impulse, and more about process. The mask here isn't warmth. It's normalcy through invisibility. Bundy is the blueprint for the charismatic mask. He didn't just blend in, he stood out. Educated, well-spoken, politically engaged, attractive by societal standards. He weaponized trust. The psychological mask: Bundy's strength was cognitive empathy. He could read people, mirror emotions, create instant familiarity. But emotionally, there was a disconnect. Victims weren't experienced as people. They were part of a narrative he controlled. The duality: Bundy could help someone carry books, then use that exact moment of trust to attack. That's what made him effective and terrifying. Because his mask didn't just hide him, it pulled people in.
When you line them up, the differences are clear. Killer mask type: core trait, risk style. Kohberger: intellectual, detached obsession, internal process, targeted, controlled. Bundy: charismatic, engaging manipulation, social engineering, opportunistic but planned. Keyes: invisible, compartmentalized control, patience, highly strategic, long-term. But underneath those differences, there are shared threads: emotional detachment, internal justification, ability to separate self from action. Here's what connects all 3 in the most unsettling way: none of them needed to look like killers. They built identities that allowed them to move freely, avoid suspicion, control perception, and once someone can control how they're perceived, they can control how long they go unnoticed.
We tend to think the real person is underneath. But in many of these cases, the mask is part of the person. It's not just hiding something, it's enabling it. Bundy needed charm to access victims. Keyes needed invisibility to avoid patterns. Kohberger, if aligned with the theory, needed detachment to operate internally. Different strategies, same outcome. A life lived in two layers. One the world sees, and one that only shows itself when it's too late.